Knights Errant of the Wilderness by Morden H. Long, published 1919 and read by Cody, author of Auke-wingeke-tawso, or Defender of His Country, The Circumstances and Services of Charles Michel de Langlade. Knights Errant of the Wilderness, Chapter 3, Henry Kelsey. On May 17th, 1684, Radisson, as we have seen, sailed in the Happy Return to re-establish the English company in their fort on the Nelson River, which he and Groseilliers had seized. In the self-same ship was a little lad, Henry Kelsey, who was destined to be the pioneer explorer inland from the Hudson's Bay. Henry was a poor boy who had grown up in the streets of London. The company, in search of apprentice lads for service at their posts in the bay, had picked him off the streets and taken him into their employment at a salary of £8 a year and his keep. Many an idle day in London Henry had haunted the wharves and dockyards of the Thames, watching with wistful eyes the ships as they set out on their long voyages to strange foreign lands. From the old salts who gathered on the waterside, he had heard many a tale of pirates on the Spanish Main, of adventurers in the far-off Indies, of slave raiding on the coasts of Africa, and of whale and seal fishing in the polar seas. What he could not have given to bear a part in such stirring deeds. And now he was actually off on a voyage of thousands of miles, and in the same ship with the famous Frenchman, who had been received by the king and whose exploits had been the talk of all London. Radisson had roamed and fought to his heart's content over half the continent, and now he, too, Henry Kelsey, London's street Arab, was bound for the great bay, which was the gateway to the land of the savage painted redskins, the land of forest and streams, of hair-breadth adventure, and of wonderful wealth from the fur trade. To a rousing cheer, the company's flag, with its white-lettered HBC, fluttered up to the masthead. An extra ration of grog was served around to put all in good humor at the starting. The sailors chanted their sea songs as they ran briskly around the capspan. The anchor thus was hoisted aboard and is made snug for the voyage. Little Henry had not lived by his wits in London for nothing. He was yet but a half-grown lad, and his face had not acquired the healthy bronze of the life of the sea and the woods, but he was irrepressibly active in body and mind. Soon he had searched out every nook and cranny in the entire vessel. He seemed to be everywhere about the ship, and nothing escaped his sharp eyes. Now he was aloft in the rigging, peering around the horizon for the sails of strange ships. Now he was down in the galley, coaxing the cook for dainties. He listened with eager ears to the tales of the seamen in the forecastle, and sometimes, as Radisson paced the deck, he caught fragments of his adventurers as they fell from his lips in his queer-spoken English. Everything in the voyage delighted him. After his first spell of seasickness was over, he loved to watch the little ship make her way out over the smoldering billows, now engulfed in the trough between foam-capped summits, and next moment with the spray dashing over the bow, and the scuppers awash, borne aloft like a cork towards the crest of an oncoming wave. The lengthening days, as the ship bore ever more to the north, filled him with wonder. He was the first to observe the marvellous sight of whales sprouting in the distance, and of the gambols of a school of porpoises that followed the ship caused him infinite merriment. When they entered the strait, he was struck with amazement at the mountains of ice that they encountered, drifting slowly out towards the ocean, and flashing back the sun's rays from 1,000 dazzling crystal points and surfaces. Past great ice floes on which an occasional polar bear was spied, past Digges Island with its myriad nesting wild fowl, they went, and then southwest across the bay, until they cast anchor in the mouth of the Nelson River. It was a scene strangely different from that which the little lad had left behind him. Instead of the quiet estuary of the Thames, the swirling muddy current of the rapid Nelson, instead of the peaceful thatched-roofed villages, the green hedges, and the cultivated fields of Kent and Essex, nothing but dreary swamp and sombre forests, from the water's edge far as the eye could see. Instead of London, with its church spires, palaces, and theatres, its marts and warehouses, its maze of streets and busy thronging citizens, instead of these, a ruined fort in a little clearing on the shore, and all around a howling wilderness, the home of the wild beasts and scattered wandering savages. But the prospect did not appall the little apprentice lad in the least. He was one of those happy spirits that make themselves at home everywhere. He was all excited to land and begin work, and he took his full boy's share in the erection of the new fort and the preparations for trade with the natives. Then came the Indians. The Anishinaabe, from the great Saskatchewan Valley, sweeping down the swift current of the Nelson with their canoes loaded deep with furs. Trade, in those days, was no simple matter. First, the governor would adorn himself in all the finery of scarlet cloak and gold lace, and gird on his sword at his side. Then all the musicians that the fort could muster were marshalled in front of the governor, whose approach was thus heralded by the blaring of bugles, the screaming of fifes, and the thunderous roll of kettle-drums. Behind, drawn up fully in martial array, came all the company's men. Proceeding thus, with full pomp, to the Indian encampment, the governor gave greeting to the chief and his tribesmen, and the conference began. The chief, with great professions of friendship, would present all his furs, beaver and marten, fox, and more, to the governor as a gift, while the latter responded with an equivalent gift of guns, powder, shot, blankets, hatchets, beads, and other such trinkets drawn from the company's stores. Both then puffed clouds of smoke from the peace pipe, and the two parties went their ways, satisfied. But the rules of the company's trade and the discipline of its forts were exceedingly strict. None but the governor or chief trader could thus conduct trade. All others of the company's men were absolutely forbidden to hold any converse with the Indians or to leave the fort to hunt with them, except by special permission. Only thus, the adventurers thought, could they control all the trade and keep their employers from getting furs for themselves, thus cutting into their business. But Kelsey was used to having his own way in life in the London streets, and all these rules irked him sorely. Not that he wished to cheat the company and trade for himself, but because, boylike, he was full of curiosity about his new land and its people. So he lost no opportunity to slip away from the fort and mix with the Indians, whose friendship he soon won. They were delighted with the audacious white boy, who did not stand aloof from them like the others, but visited them in their teepees, went for hunts with them in the forest, and was quickly learning to speak their tongue. For some time this went on, either because Kelsey was clever enough to conceal his pranks, or because Governor Geyer overlooked them on account of his youth. At last, however, the governor grew angry and sternly forbade Kelsey to have anything more to do with the Indians. But Henry again broke the rules, and when the gates were locked, he even climbed over the fort palisades to visit his friends. For this, the governor, now in a rage, gave him a thorough thrashing. But this proved too much. Henry liked his Anishinaabe friends and their wild free life better than with Governor Geyer, his rules and his beatings. So when the next day dawned, no Kelsey appeared for his duties. High and low they looked for him through the fort, and they sought in the neighboring forest, but nowhere was he to be found. He had vanished. The untracked wilderness had swallowed him into its depth, and his friends at the fort gave him up for lost. Months passed, and there came not a word from the adventurous lad. The French king and his governor at Quebec had now fully realized that if the English retained their hold on the bay, New France would be hemmed in, both north and south, by their power. So through England and France were yet at peace. In the summer of 1686, a party of daring coureurs de bois, under the Chevalier de Troyes, and the dashing young French Canadian, Pierre Le Moyne de Iberville, made the long journey across the height of land and swooped suddenly down on the bay. The English were completely surprised. Fort Moose, Fort Rupert, and Fort Albany fell into the hands of the French, and Nelson alone was left to the English company. Long ago, Radisson and Groseilliers had urged the adventurers not to remain content with their posts on the shores of the bay, but to penetrate far afield to the very heart of the surrounding regions. Forts planted there would both increase the company's trade and make firm its grip on the vast empire which King Charles had granted them. But their plea had fallen on deaf ears. Now, however, with 3 of their 4 forts in the hands of the French, the company, in order to still get furs, must either build new posts inland or send far into the interior and persuade more and more Indian tribes to come down with their pelts to Fort Nelson. But who, of all the company's servants, had knowledge and daring to accomplish this task? Such was the situation when an Indian runner arrived from inland at the fort. He bore a piece of birch bark on which some weathersome characters, roughly written in charcoal. These words were in English. It was a message from Henry Kelsey. He was alive and well and had wandered far with the Indians. If the governor would only pardon him and let him come back, he would conduct an exploring party for the company and would bring down to its fort many new tribes. The governor was overjoyed. Kelsey's pardon was instantly dispatched. A little later, he himself arrived at the fort. Tall as a man he now was, and keen-eyed, hardy, and bronzed from his life in the woods. Decked out in all the trappings of an Indian brave, he stepped from his canoe amid the warm greetings of his old friends at the fort. But he was not alone. Close behind came a dusky Anishinaabe maiden, whom he had married by Indian rites. At first the governor would not let her enter the gates, but Kelsey stood by his wife and refused to enter alone. As he was too valuable a man for the company to lose, Governor Geyer relented, and so Mr. and Mrs. Kelsey, as they were laughingly styled, were received together into the fort. Henry Kelsey was now the hero of the hour at Fort Nelson. Word of his exploits was sent back to England, and in 1688 we find the adventurers sending out orders to Governor Geyer to dispatch, quote, the boy, Henry Kelsey, end quote, to Churchill River, because, quote, we are informed he is a very active lad, delighting much in Indians' company, being never better pleased than when he is travelling amongst them, end quote. There is no further record of what Kelsey did at Churchill, but probably he was sent to that river, where as yet there was no fort, to bring the northern Chippewa Indians down to Fort Nelson to trade. In 1691, however, Governor Geyer writes, quote, this summer I sent up Henry Kelsey, who cheerfully undertook the journey in the country of the Anishinaabe poet, with the captain of that nation, that is, chief, to call, encourage, and invite the remoter Indians to trade with us, end quote. Of this journey, the most important achievement of his career, Kelsey has left us his own record, which still may be seen at Hudson's Bay House in London. On July 15, 1691, a fleet of canoes shot out from beneath Deering's Point and began to stem the rapid current of the Nelson River. They were Stone or Auke-wingeke-tawso Indians, starting back on the long trip from Fort Nelson to their home in the Saskatchewan Valley. They bore with them muskets and kettles and trinkets which they had obtained by trade at the white man's fort on the bay, and with them, taking his turn with the rest at paddle and portage, was a solitary white man. It was Henry Kelsey, adventuring himself for a second time into the wilds to the west of Hudson Bay. For 3 days they persevered against the strong currents, and then, impatient at their slow progress, Kelsey cached his canoe and went on alone overland ahead of his Indians. The weather was very dry and game was exceedingly scarce. As he had to rely for food on what he could shoot, Kelsey was soon in a serious position. After 30 hot miles of trampling through the thick brush, he stumbled at last on 3 Indian wigwams, but no one, man, woman, or child, was at home. The famishing hunter ransacked the encampment, but not a scrap of food could be found. A few berries gathered in a bush stayed his hunger for a while, but it was with a great joy and relief that presently he heard noises in the distance. It was the owners of the teepees returning from the hunt. They had shot 10 swans and a moose and were ready to share with the tired traveler. They also were Anishinaabe Indians, and in their company, Kelsey journeyed on for 11 more days until he rejoined his own party. With them now were some Crees, and these told him that the Auke-wingeke-tawso poet Indians, whom Kelsey especially wished to meet and bring down to Fort Nelson for trade, had killed 3 Cree squaws in the spring, and the two nations were now at war with each other. For more than 300 miles Kelsey's path had lain through a forest country of spruce and pine. Now the trees changed to poplar and birch, gradually growing thinner until the party reached the edge of the open plain. It was August 19th when they thus got clear of the woods and found, stretching southward and westward before them, the endless rolling expanse of the prairie. Buffalo had been sighted on the preceding day, and now they were found roaming in such great herds that all fear of famine was over. During the day the men hunted, and at evening the women went out to bring in and prepare meat for the feast. Once, while out hunting, Kelsey fell asleep, exhausted by the chase afoot through the long grass of the plain. For hours he slumbered on, and when he awoke he was lost. Not a companion was in sight. The dust cloud, even raised by the hunters and buffalo, had settled again to the plain. Around him, waist-high and as far as the eye could see, was nothing but the prairie grass, stirred into endless billows by the summer wind. He wandered hopelessly till dusk. Then the glare of Indian campfires in the sky gave him his direction, and at night he struggled wearily into camp. On another occasion, when the campfire had been made from dry moss, Kelsey suddenly awoke to find the grass all around him alight and blazing furiously. Calling for help, he managed by desperate efforts to smother and beat out the flames, but the stock of his musket was badly burned. Kelsey, however, was not at a loss. With his knife he soon fashioned another, which did great service for the rest of the trip. After traveling for 7 days across the prairie, they again came to a wooded land. It was here that Kelsey had his dangerous encounter with the grizzlies, the most formidable of all the beasts of the Great West. He was out hunting with an Indian when, all of a sudden, they were confronted by 2 immense bears. The bears were as much surprised as the men by the meeting. They advanced boldly, however, the fear of the rifle being unknown to them. The terrified Indian at once bolted for a tree, while Kelsey himself dashed into a clump of willows. The bears pursued the Indian to his tree, and it would have gone hard with them, had not Kelsey, by a lucky shot, killed one of them. The other now made in the direction of the white hunter, but unable to find him in the thick brush, turned back again to attack the Indian, when, with a second shot, Kelsey stretched him beside his mate. 2 grizzly bears were no small bag for a few minutes' hunting. Kelsey's credit now stood higher than ever with the Indians, who, filled with admiration for his prowess with the rifle, named him Miss Top Ashish, which means, quote, the little giant, end quote. On August 24th, they were joined by Washa, a great chief of the Anishinaabe, and the party now numbered upwards of 80 teepees. On September 11th, they reached the camp of the long-sought Auke-wingeke-tawso poets. Kelsey pitched his tent, filled his great peace pipe with his best tobacco, and, with great ceremony, invited the Auke-wingeke-tawso chieftain to pay him a visit. The chief came in full state with his mightiest warriors at his back. On behalf of the great white chief of the bay, Kelsey presented him with gifts: a laced coat, a cap, a sash, a musket with powder and shot, knives, owls, and tobacco. With these, the chief was much delighted, and readily promised to meet his white brother at Deering's Point in the spring, and thus go down to Fort Nelson for trade. Kelsey had now traveled from 500 to 600 miles inland from the bay, and, as far as we can tell, was somewhere in what is now the province of Saskatchewan, somewhat to the north of the Great River. There, apparently, he passed the winter among the Indians, inviting all whom he met to trade with the company and striving to make peace among the warring tribes. For the adventurers wished the Indians to spend their powder and shot, not on each other, but in the hunt for furs, which the traders drew their wealth. Thus, in the spring of 1692, Governor Geyer wrote home to the governing committee in London, quote, Henry Kelsey came down with a good fleet of Indians, and hath travelled and endeavoured to keep peace amongst them, according to my orders, end quote. This successful exploit of the one-time street ragamuffin of London now won him rapid promotion. Of all the company's men on the bay, he had the best knowledge of the land and the strongest control over the Indians. By 1697, he had risen to be deputy governor of Fort York at the mouth of the Hayes River, and in 1713 he was made governor of York Factory, and thus became second in command on the whole bay. With his greatest claim to fame is that, except for Radisson and Groseilliers, he was the first white man to explore any part of the great Northwest, the first to visit the western Indian tribes, and the first to behold and hunt the buffalo, the mighty monarch of the plains. Though the adventurers for many a long year yet were to rest content with forts on the shores of Hudson's Bay, none the less the journeys of Henry Kelsey, quote, the Little Giant, of the Anishinaabe, foreshadowed the days when the great company was to awake from its slumber, shake off its sloth, and send its explorers and its trading bands to the utmost confines of the vast territories which by royal grant and charter were theirs.